Step into a world where time itself holds the key to a dark and chilling secret. In the heart of an old, forgotten estate, a single, silent witness remains a grandfather clock, its hands frozen at the stroke of 12. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? In the clock that stopped at midnight, a clue to a chilling mystery, we'll follow a detective haunted by his own past as he unravels a crime that's far more twisted than he could ever imagine. Every tick of the clock is a step closer to the truth, and every secret uncovered is a step deeper into danger. Before we begin our descent into this labyrinth of lies, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss a single second of this thrilling investigation. Hit that subscribe button, and let's turn back the hands of time. The rain fell on the cobblestones of Blackwood Manor with a relentless, percussive rhythm, each drop a tiny hammer against the ancient stone. It was a fitting soundtrack for the scene inside, a symphony of gloom for a house that had just become a tomb. Detective Miles Corbin felt the chill of the place seep into his bones, a damp, penetrating cold that had little to do with the October storm raging outside. It was the cold of death, a stillness that even the flickering hurricane lamps brought in by the forensics team could not warm. At the center of it all, in the grand, two-story library, stood the silent sentinel. It was a magnificent grandfather clock, a masterpiece of mahogany and polished brass that reached nearly to the vaulted ceiling. Its intricate carvings depicted scenes from forgotten myths, its face a disk of porcelain and gold. But its pendulum was still, its hands frozen, pointing defiantly at the Roman numeral for 12. It had stopped at midnight, and so, it seemed, had the life of Lord Alistair Blackwood. He lay sprawled in a high-backed leather armchair not 10 feet from the clock, a silken dressing gown askew, revealing the stark, final stillness of his chest. A half-empty glass of brandy sat on the small table beside him, next to an overturned book. There were no overt signs of violence, no blood, no struggle. To a casual observer, he might have been sleeping. But Miles had been a detective for 15 years, and he knew the profound, unnatural emptiness of a room where a life had just been violently extinguished. "Coroner's initial assessment is cardiac arrest, detective," said Officer Riley, a young, eager cop whose slicker was still dripping onto the priceless Persian rug. "But he's not willing to rule anything out until the full autopsy." Miles grunted, his gaze fixed on the scene. A man in perfect health, according to his doctor, has a sudden heart attack at the precise moment his priceless, meticulously maintained clock stops working? I don't buy that kind of coincidence. He walked over to the clock, running a gloved finger over its cool, polished surface. "Forensics checked it?" "Yes, sir. No prints other than the victims and the housekeepers. According to her, she winds it every Sunday. It was in perfect working order." "And the time of death?" "The coroner places it between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. He says it's impossible to be more specific at this stage. The stopped clock is our best bet for a precise time." Miles stared at the clock's frozen hands. It was more than a clue. It felt like a statement, a declaration. This is when it happened. This is the moment everything ended. It was theatrical, deliberate. Killers who were this bold were either very smart or very stupid. Miles had a feeling he wasn't dealing with the latter. He turned his attention to the inhabitants of the manor, a collection of strained faces and shadowed eyes huddled in the drawing room. They were a cast of characters straight out of a Gothic novel. There was Lady Eleanor Blackwood, Alistair's much younger, strikingly beautiful wife, her grief looking performative, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Beside her sat Julian Blackwood, Alistair's nephew and heir, a man whose ambition was poorly concealed beneath a veneer of practiced sorrow. He was watching Eleanor with an intensity that was unsettling. In a corner, trying to make herself invisible, was Clara, the mousy, devoted housekeeper who had been with the family for decades. Her hands were twisting a handkerchief, her face pale with genuine shock. And finally, there was Dr. Eris Thorne, the family physician and a close friend of Alistair's, who had been a dinner guest that evening. He projected an air of professional calm, yet his gaze kept drifting towards the library, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. They all had a motive, of course. Money was the most obvious. Alistair Blackwood was one of the wealthiest men in the country. Eleanor stood to inherit a fortune, provided the prenuptial agreement held up. Julian, who had been managing the family's finances with a notable lack of success, was now in control of the entire estate. Clara, despite her apparent devotion, could have been nursing a secret grudge. And Dr. Thorne? Miles knew that friendship and medicine could often hide the darkest of secrets. He began the interviews in the drawing room, the storm outside providing a dramatic, rolling underscore. Each of them had an alibi of sorts. They had all been in the manor that night, but they had all retired to their separate rooms after dinner, around 10 p.m. No one admitted to seeing or hearing anything unusual. Alistair was in high spirits, Dr. Thorne claimed, his voice smooth and measured. We shared a bottle of excellent port. He was excited about a new acquisition for his collection. What collection? Miles asked. Alistair was a horologist, Thorne explained, a collector of rare and antique clocks. The grandfather clock in the library was the crown jewel of his collection. He called it the Chronos. This new piece of information sent a jolt through Miles. The murder weapon, or at least the scene's centerpiece, was not just a piece of furniture. It was the victim's passion. The killer hadn't just stopped a clock. They had silenced the heart of Alistair's world. Eleanor, when questioned, was less composed. Her grief seemed to come in waves, interspersed with moments of sharp, almost defensive, anger. I was in my chambers reading, she insisted, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Alistair and we had an argument after dinner, a silly squabble about my spending. I went to my room to be alone. An argument about money, a classic motive. Julian was cool and collected. I was in my study going over the quarterly reports. I didn't see Uncle Alistair after he and Dr. Thorne finished their port. The last I saw him, he was heading to the library to read. He seemed almost too eager to help, providing details with a precision that felt rehearsed. Clara, the housekeeper, was the most visibly distressed. Lord Blackwood was a good man, she sobbed. He was always kind to me. I heard nothing, detective. The storm was so loud. And this old house. It groans and creaks on nights like this. She confirmed that she had wound the clock the previous Sunday, as she always did. It's never stopped before. Never. As the night wore on, the initial sweep of the manor yielded nothing. There was no sign of a forced entry. Nothing appeared to be stolen. The only thing out of place was the dead man in the chair and the silent clock that stood guard over him. Miles found himself repeatedly drawn back to the library, to the imposing presence of the Chronos. He examined it again, more closely this time. The glass case was locked, the key nowhere to be found. How had the killer stopped it? Had they picked the lock? Or was there another way? He noticed a series of small, almost invisible scratches near the hinge of the clock's face. It was possible a tool had been used. He also found something else. Tucked into the pages of the book that had fallen to the floor beside Alistair was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a receipt from a local antique shop, dated 2 days prior. The item purchased was listed as clock winding key, custom-made. So someone had recently acquired a key. Alistair himself? Or someone else? The housekeeper had her own key, which she dutifully produced. It was old and ornate. The idea that someone else had a key, a new key, was a tantalizing lead. As the first light of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, Miles stood alone in the library. The forensics team had packed up, and Alistair's body had been taken away. The room was now officially a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape. But the silence remained, a heavy, oppressive blanket. He looked at the clock, its hands still pointing to midnight. It was a puzzle, a taunt. The killer had left him a calling card, a single, perfect clue that was also a complete enigma. Told him when, but not how or why. He had a list of suspects, a handful of motives, and a house full of secrets. He knew that somewhere within the labyrinthine corridors and hidden chambers of Blackwood Manor, the truth was waiting. It was hidden in the whispers of the past, in the guarded glances of the living, and in the silent, unblinking face of the clock that had stopped at midnight. The investigation had just begun, and Miles had a chilling feeling that Lord Alistair Blackwood would not be the last victim of the secrets that this house held. The hands of the clock were frozen, but for everyone else, time was running out. The autopsy report on Lord Alistair Blackwood landed on Detective Miles Corbin's desk with a thud that seemed to echo the finality of its contents. The coroner had found what he was looking for: a minuscule puncture mark at the base of the skull, almost invisible to the naked eye. The cause of death was not cardiac arrest. It was poison, a rare and fast-acting neurotoxin derived from the venom of a species of tropical frog. It induced massive cardiac arrest within minutes, leaving almost no trace. It was the weapon of a sophisticated and knowledgeable killer. The discovery shifted the entire focus of the investigation. This was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous act. It was a premeditated, carefully planned execution. The theatricality of the stopped clock now made a chilling kind of sense. The killer had wanted them to know the exact time of death, perhaps as a way of cementing an alibi, or perhaps for a more symbolic, sinister reason. Miles's first stop was the antique shop from the receipt he'd found. It was a dusty, cluttered place run by a wizened old man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He remembered the transaction clearly. Alistair Blackwood himself came in, the shopkeeper recalled, polishing a silver locket. Said he'd lost the spare winding key to his grandfather clock. He brought in a photograph and the clock's serial number. I had a replacement custom-made for him. This was an unexpected twist. Alistair had been the one to buy the key. But why? Clara, the housekeeper, had a key. Why would he need another? And more importantly, where was it now? A thorough search of Alistair's personal effects had turned up nothing. The investigation turned next to the source of the poison. It was so rare that only a handful of labs in the country had access to it. Miles began the tedious process of cross-referencing that list with anyone connected to the Blackwood family. He got a hit almost immediately. Dr. Eris Thorne had once worked for a pharmaceutical company that had conducted research on that very toxin for potential medical applications. The family physician was now their prime suspect. When Miles confronted him, Thorne's professional calm finally shattered. He admitted to his past work with the toxin but vehemently denied any involvement in the murder. "Yes, I know of the poison," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know how to administer it, but I would never. Alistair was my friend. A friend whose much younger wife you seem to have a more than professional interest in," Miles said, his voice cold and flat. He had received a report from one of the junior officers who had been canvassing the local village. The gossip was that Dr. Thorne and Lady Eleanor Blackwood had been seen together on several occasions, looking far too comfortable for a doctor and his patient's wife. Thorne's face flushed. Eleanor was unhappy in her marriage. Alistair was controlling. I was a sympathetic ear, nothing more. And a convenient solution to her problem? Miles pressed. With you and your medical knowledge, and her with a claim to the Blackwood fortune? Thorne was adamant in his denial, but the seed of suspicion had been firmly planted. He had the means and a potential motive, but his alibi, like everyone else's, was that he had been in his room at the time of the murder. To prove his involvement, Miles would need to break that alibi. He turned his attention to Julian Blackwood, the ambitious nephew. A deep dive into the Blackwood estate's finances revealed a shocking truth. The family fortune was on the brink of collapse. Julian had made a series of disastrous investments, losing millions. He was in deep, and Alistair had recently discovered the extent of his nephew's incompetence. An email found on Alistair's computer, sent the day of the murder, was a scathing indictment of Julian's actions, ending with the threat of cutting him off completely. Julian's motive was now clear as day. With Alistair dead, he was in control of what was left of the estate, free to try and salvage his reputation and cover his tracks. But like Thorne, he claimed to have been in his study alone. The investigation was a tangled web of secrets and lies. Everyone in the house had a reason to want Alistair dead. but only one of them could have been in the library at midnight to administer the poison and stop the clock. Frustrated, Miles returned to the manor, drawn once again to the silent presence of the Chronos. He was convinced the clock held the answer. He needed to understand its history, its significance. He found what he was looking for in Alistair's private study, in a series of leather-bound journals filled with his meticulous research on horology. The Chronos was more than just a clock. It was a historical artifact with a dark and bloody past. It had been built in the 18th century by a brilliant but unstable clockmaker who was rumored to be an alchemist and a member of a secret society. The clock was said to be cursed, bringing misfortune to all who owned it. It had passed through the hands of aristocrats who had met untimely ends, of collectors who had gone mad. Alistair had acquired it at an auction, obsessed with its history and its intricate, one-of-a-kind mechanism. One detail in the journal stood out. The clockmaker had built a secret feature into the Chronos. At the stroke of midnight on the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, a hidden compartment in the clock would open for exactly 1 minute. It was a feature Alistair had been eagerly waiting to witness. The night of his murder was the autumnal equinox. This was the breakthrough Miles had been looking for. The secret compartment could explain so much. Perhaps the killer had hidden the murder weapon or the missing key inside. But it also raised a new question. Who else knew about this secret? Alistair had been a secretive man, unlikely to have shared this information with anyone. Miles decided to take a gamble. He would need to wait until the next day, when a specialist from the National Museum, an expert in antique clock mechanisms, was due to arrive. But he had a feeling he was on the right track. That evening, as he was preparing to leave the manor, Clara, the housekeeper, approached him, her face etched with worry. "Detective," she whispered, "there's something I need to tell you. I wasn't entirely truthful before." She explained that, on the night of the murder, she hadn't gone straight to bed. She had been in the kitchen, preparing a late-night snack, when she heard voices coming from the direction of the library. It was Alistair and Julian, and they were arguing. "It was a terrible fight," she said, her voice shaking. "I heard Lord Blackwood say something about ruin and disgrace, and then I heard a crash, like glass breaking." Clara's testimony shattered Julian's alibi. He had not been in his study all evening. He had been with his uncle just before the time of death. The broken glass could have been the brandy glass found next to Alistair's chair. Armed with this new information, Miles went to confront Julian. The young man's cool demeanor crumbled under the weight of the accusation. He admitted to the argument. "He was going to expose me," Julian confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "He was going to tell the world I had squandered the family fortune. My life would have been over." He admitted to the fight, to the shouting, to the moment he had knocked the brandy glass from his uncle's hand in a fit of rage. But he swore he had left his uncle alive. "I stormed out of the library and went straight to my room. I didn't kill him. I swear it." It was a compelling confession, but it still didn't explain how the poison was administered or how the clock was stopped. Julian claimed to know nothing about the clock's secrets. The next day, the clock specialist arrived. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman with an encyclopedic knowledge of antique timepieces. Miles explained the situation and his theory about the secret compartment. Intrigued, she set to work. She examined the Chronos with a reverence that bordered on worship. "It's a masterpiece," she murmured, running her fingers over the intricate carvings. "But the legends are true. It's a notoriously difficult clock to maintain. The mechanism is a work of genius, but it's also incredibly temperamental." She confirmed the existence of the secret compartment, explaining that it was controlled by a complex series of gears and levers that were keyed to the astronomical calendar. But she also discovered something else, something that sent a chill down Miles's spine. "The clock's mainspring has been tampered with," she said, her eye pressed to a magnifying loupe. "Someone has deliberately created a flaw in it, a weak point that would cause it to fail under the right amount of tension." "Meaning what?" Miles asked. "Meaning," she said, looking up at him, "that the clock was rigged to stop. It wasn't an accident." It wasn't a coincidence. Someone wanted this clock to stop at exactly midnight. The revelation was a bombshell. The killer had not just happened upon a stopped clock. They had engineered it. This was a level of planning and sophistication that was truly terrifying. The specialist continued her examination, and a few minutes later, she made another discovery. Wedged deep within the clock's intricate mechanism was a small, almost invisible piece of fabric. It was a dark blue thread, clearly from a piece of clothing. Miles now had two crucial pieces of physical evidence: the knowledge of the tampered mainspring and the blue thread. He had broken one suspect's alibi and uncovered a powerful motive. He was getting closer, he could feel it. But as he stood in the library that evening, the silent clock looming over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still missing a vital piece of the puzzle. The killer was smart, meticulous, and always one step ahead. And in a house built on a foundation of secrets and lies, the most dangerous truth was the one that was still hidden, waiting in the shadows, like the patient, silent ticking of a clock counting down to a final, deadly revelation. The whispers of the past were growing louder, and Miles knew that if he didn't solve this case soon, they would claim another victim. The discovery that the Chronos had been deliberately rigged to stop at midnight sent shockwaves through the investigation. This was no longer just a murder. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, with the clock as its centerpiece. Detective Miles Corbin felt like he was locked in a battle of wits with a phantom, a killer who was both a meticulous planner and a cunning manipulator. The blue thread found in the clock's mechanism became his most promising lead. The forensics lab identified it as high-quality wool, dyed with an expensive, custom-blended indigo. It was the kind of fabric one would find on a bespoke suit or a designer gown. Miles methodically collected clothing from each of the suspects. Julian Blackwood's wardrobe was full of expensive suits, but none matched the thread. Dr. Thorne's clothes were more modest, and Lady Eleanor's collection of designer gowns, while extensive, contained nothing made of that specific wool. The investigation seemed to have hit a wall. Every lead led to a dead end. Every theory was met with a new contradiction. The tangled web of relationships within the manor was becoming more and more complex. Miles discovered that Eleanor was not just confiding in Dr. Thorne. She had also been having a secret affair with Julian. The two of them, it seemed, had been planning a future together, a future that was contingent on Alistair's death. When confronted, they both admitted to the affair, but they turned on each other, each accusing the other of being the killer. Julian was desperate, Eleanor claimed, her beautiful face a mask of fear. He would have done anything to get his hands on the estate. Eleanor is the one you should be looking at, Julian countered, his voice dripping with venom. She hated Alistair. She felt trapped. She's a master manipulator, detective. She could convince anyone to do anything for her. They were both plausible suspects, both with strong motives. But the physical evidence didn't point conclusively to either of them. Miles decided to change his approach. Instead of focusing on the who, he would focus on the how. How did the killer get access to the clock's mechanism to tamper with the mainspring? And how did they administer the poison without leaving a trace? He returned to the library, the scene of the crime, and began a meticulous inch-by-inch search. He was convinced the house itself held the key. Blackwood Manor was an ancient, sprawling edifice, full of hidden passages and secret rooms. It was a place where a person could move about unseen, a place where secrets could be hidden for centuries. With the help of the manor's original blueprints, which he found in the town archives, he began to map out the house's hidden architecture. He discovered a network of servants' passages, long since sealed up, that connected many of the main rooms. And then he found it. A small, almost invisible door hidden behind a bookshelf in the library. The door opened into a narrow, dusty passage that snaked through the walls of the house. It was a perfect way for someone to enter the library, commit the murder, and leave without being seen. He followed the passage, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. It led him to a small, hidden chamber, more of a closet than a room. And in that chamber, he found something that made his blood run cold. On a small, dusty shelf sat a collection of vials and medical equipment. And in a locked metal box, he found a small, preserved specimen of the poison dart frog, the source of the neurotoxin that had killed Alistair. This was the killer's lair, the secret laboratory where they had prepared the murder weapon. But there was something else in the room, something that was even more shocking. It was a small, leather-bound diary. The handwriting was elegant and feminine. It was the diary of Alistair's first wife, Beatrice Blackwood, who had died 20 years ago, officially from a sudden illness. As Miles read the diary, a new, and far more sinister, story began to emerge. Beatrice had not been ill. She had been slowly poisoned, her health deteriorating over a period of months. She wrote of her suspicions, of her fear of her husband, a man she described as cold, cruel, and obsessed with his collection of clocks. She believed he was poisoning her, but she had no proof. The last entry was a single, chilling sentence. "I know he will kill me soon. I fear it will be at midnight." The revelation was a seismic shock. Alistair Blackwood, the victim, had been a murderer himself. He had killed his first wife. The current murder was not a simple crime of greed or passion. It was an act of revenge, an echo of a crime committed 2 decades ago. This changed everything. The motive was no longer just money or freedom. It was justice, twisted and dark. But who would have known Beatrice's secret? Who would have cared enough to avenge her death after 20 years? The answer came to him in a flash of insight. He remembered the way Clara, the housekeeper, had spoken of Alistair, her grief seeming so genuine. But he also remembered the way she had looked at the portrait of Beatrice that hung in the main hall, a look of profound, almost reverent sadness. He went to find her. She was in the kitchen, calmly polishing silver, her demeanor as composed as ever. But when Miles confronted her with the diary, her composure finally broke. The story she told was one of heartbreak and a long-nursed desire for revenge. Clara had been more than just a housekeeper to Beatrice. She had been her closest friend and confidant. She had watched as the vibrant, vivacious woman she had known had wasted away, and she had been powerless to stop it. She had suspected Alistair, but she could never prove it. After Beatrice's death, she had stayed on at the manor, a silent, patient observer, waiting for her chance. She had been the one to find Beatrice's diary, hidden in the secret chamber. It had confirmed her darkest suspicions and solidified her resolve. She had spent years planning her revenge, studying Alistair's habits, his obsessions. She had learned about the secret compartment in the Chronos, about his fascination with poisons. She had used his own methods against him. "He deserved to die," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper, devoid of any remorse. "He deserved to die at the same moment he had killed my dear Beatrice. Midnight, the time he was so obsessed with." She explained how she had done it. She had used her housekeeper's key to access the clock, carefully tampering with the mainspring. She had acquired the poison over a period of years, from a series of discreet online sources. On the night of the murder, she had used the secret passage to enter the library. Alistair had been so engrossed in his book, he had never heard her approach. A single, swift prick with a needle tipped in the poison was all it took. She had then waited for the clock to stop, a final, poetic punctuation to her act of vengeance. But there was still one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. The blue thread. Clara's simple, gray uniform didn't match. A slow smile spread across Clara's face. "The thread was not from my clothes, detective. It was from yours." Miles stared at her, confused. And then he remembered. The day he had first arrived at the manor, he had been wearing his best suit, a dark blue wool. He had leaned against the clock while examining it, his jacket brushing against the intricate mechanism. Clara had been there. She had seen him. It was a brilliant, audacious piece of misdirection. She had planted the thread herself after the fact to throw him off the scent, to implicate one of the other suspects. She had been playing a long, patient game, and she had almost won. The tangled web had finally been unraveled. The killer was the one person no one had suspected, the quiet, unassuming woman who had been hiding in plain sight. She was not a monster, but a woman driven to a monstrous act by love and grief. As Miles led her away, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The ghosts of the past had been exorcised. But the silence of the library, the empty chair, and the stopped clock remained, a permanent, chilling monument to the secrets that had been kept, and the price that had been paid, for a revenge that had been 20 years in the making. The clock's hands were still frozen at midnight, a timeless reminder that some secrets, no matter how long they are buried, will always find a way to surface, and that the past is never truly dead. It's not even past. The confession of Clara, the quiet housekeeper turned avenging angel, should have been the end of the story. The case was closed, the killer was in custody, and the dark secrets of Blackwood Manor had been dragged into the light. But for Detective Miles Corbin, something still felt profoundly wrong. Clara's confession was too neat, too perfect. It answered all the questions, but it didn't satisfy the gnawing unease in his gut. He kept replaying the scene in his mind. Clara, the grieving friend, meticulously planning her revenge for 2 decades, learning the complex arts of horology and toxicology, all while maintaining the facade of a simple, devoted servant. It was a compelling narrative, but was it plausible? His doubts centered on the clock. Tampering with the mainspring of the Chronos was not a simple task. The specialist had described the mechanism as a work of genius notoriously temperamental. It would have required a level of skill and knowledge that seemed far beyond that of a self-taught housekeeper. And then there was the poison. Acquiring a rare neurotoxin from the internet was one thing. Knowing how to extract it, stabilize it, and administer it in a precise, lethal dose was another entirely. Miles decided to pay a visit to Clara in her holding cell. He found her calm, almost serene, a woman at peace with her actions. He pressed her on the details, on the mechanics of her plan. He asked her to describe the process of altering the mainspring, to explain the chemical properties of the poison. Her answers were vague, filled with generalities. She claimed to have learned from old books she found in Alistair's library. When he pushed for specifics, she became agitated. "I did it," she insisted, her voice rising. "I am the one who avenged Beatrice. I am the one who brought justice to this house." It was a performance. A powerful one, but a performance nonetheless. Clara was protecting someone. Miles went back to the evidence, laying it all out on his desk, searching for the one piece that didn't fit. The custom-made key that Alistair had purchased. The blue thread from his own suit. The diary of Beatrice Blackwood. And then he saw it. The one element he had taken at face value. The diary itself. He had assumed it was genuine. A voice from the past that had set the entire tragedy in motion. But what if it wasn't? He sent the diary to the forensics lab for analysis. The results came back the next day and blew the case wide open. The ink and paper were modern. The handwriting, while a clever imitation of 19th century script, showed microscopic signs of modern penmanship. The diary was a fake. The entire foundation of the case had been a lie. Beatrice had not been murdered. She had died of a congenital heart condition, a fact confirmed by a quick check of her old medical records. Clara's motive, the epic 20-year quest for revenge, was a complete fabrication. So who had forged the diary and why? Who would go to such lengths to create a false narrative, to frame a dead man for a crime he didn't commit, and to convince a loyal housekeeper to confess to a murder she didn't carry out? The answer had to be the real killer, the person Clara was so desperately trying to protect. Miles's mind raced, reevaluating every suspect, every piece of evidence, in this new light. The affair between Eleanor and Julian, the financial ruin of the estate, the medical knowledge of Dr. Thorne. They were all powerful motives, but they didn't explain the intricate, almost obsessive level of planning, the focus on the clock, the creation of a false history. The killer wasn't just trying to get away with murder. They were trying to create a legend, a story that would overshadow the real, and perhaps more sordid, truth. He turned his attention back to the one person who had been, until now, on the periphery of the investigation, a man whose expertise had been invaluable, but whose presence had been taken for granted. Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne had the medical knowledge to handle the poison. He had a motive, his love for Eleanor. But Miles had dismissed him as a primary suspect because he couldn't connect him to the clock. Now he started digging into the doctor's past. He discovered that Thorne had not always been a simple family physician. Years ago, he had been a respected academic, a professor of medical history. And his specialty? The study of 18th and 19th century scientific instruments, including Miles found with a jolt, antique clocks. Thorne was not just a doctor, he was a hidden horologist. He had the knowledge, he had the means, he had the motive, and he had a pawn, a loyal housekeeper who would do anything to protect the memory of her beloved Beatrice, even if that memory was a complete fabrication. Miles pieced together the real sequence of events. Thorne, in love with Eleanor and desperate to free her from her controlling husband, had concocted a brilliant and diabolical plan. He had used his knowledge of history and medicine to create a crime that was also a work of art. He had forged Beatrice's diary, playing on Clara's grief and loyalty, convincing her that Alistair was a monster who deserved to die. He had then coached her on the details of the murder, creating a story that was just plausible enough to be believed. He knew that Clara would confess, that her story of long-simmering revenge would be a far more compelling narrative than a simple tale of adultery and greed. It was Thorne who had tampered with the clock, a task for which he was uniquely qualified. It was Thorne who had created the secret laboratory and prepared the poison. And it was Thorne who had committed the murder, using the secret passage to enter the library while Clara created a diversion. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Miles re-examined the evidence from the secret chamber. He found a faint, almost invisible fingerprint on one of the glass vials. It had been missed in the initial sweep. It matched the prints of Dr. Thorne. The mechanism of truth had finally been revealed. It was a complex and horrifying machine, built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Miles went to the manor to make the arrest. He found Thorne in the library, standing before the Chronos, a look of quiet admiration on his face. He didn't seem surprised to see the detective. "It's a beautiful machine, isn't it?" Thorne said, his voice calm. "A perfect system of gears and levers, all working in perfect harmony to create a single, perfect result. Like your plan," Miles said, his voice hard. "A perfect machine of lies." Thorne didn't deny it. He smiled, a thin, cold smile of intellectual pride. Alistair was a brute, a collector of beautiful things that he didn't deserve. I simply restored the balance. The confrontation was quiet, almost academic. Thorne was not a man of passion, but of cold, calculating intellect. He had seen the murder as a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be assembled. He had used people as pieces in his game, manipulating their emotions, their loyalties, their grief. As Miles led him away, he looked back at the clock, its hands still frozen at midnight. It was no longer just a clue to a chilling mystery. It was a symbol of the terrifying, intricate, and ultimately fragile nature of truth itself. The real mystery had not been about who killed Alistair Blackwood, but about the complex and invisible mechanisms that drive people to commit the most monstrous of acts. The clock had stopped, but the repercussions of its silence would echo for a long, long time. The arrest of Dr. Eris Thorne and the revelation of his intricate, manipulative plot sent a final, convulsive shock through the town and the remaining inhabitants of Blackwood Manor. The true story was more chilling than anyone could have imagined. It was not a tale of long-sought revenge or a crime of desperate passion, but a cold, intellectual exercise in murder, orchestrated by a man who saw people as puppets and life as a game. Thorne's trial was a sensation. He remained calm and detached throughout, a man who seemed to view the proceedings with a kind of academic curiosity. He never confessed, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forged diary, the fingerprint on the vial, the testimony of the clock specialist, and, most damningly, the eventual tearful recantation of Clara's confession. She had been his pawn, and her grief and loyalty had been the tools of his trade. The jury found him guilty in a matter of hours. With the truth finally revealed, the remaining pieces of the puzzle began to settle into a new, somber reality. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the woman at the center of the deadly triangle, was a broken figure. She had been a victim of her husband's control and her lover's manipulation. She sold Blackwood Manor and all its contents, including the infamous Kronos, and disappeared from public life, hoping to escape the ghosts that would forever haunt her. Julian Blackwood, humbled and disgraced, faced the consequences of his financial recklessness. He avoided prison but lost what remained of the family fortune. He was a man who had been willing to stand by and watch a murder unfold for his own gain, and he would carry that moral stain for the rest of his life. Clara, the loyal housekeeper, was released, a figure of public sympathy and pity. She had been willing to sacrifice her own freedom for a lie, for a memory she had been tricked into believing. She retreated into a quiet, anonymous life, the final, silent victim of Thorne's grand, horrific design. And what of Detective Miles Corbin? The case had been the most complex and psychologically demanding of his career. It had forced him to confront the dark, labyrinthine nature of the human mind, the way truth can be bent and broken, the way love and grief can be weaponized. He had looked into the cold, calculating eyes of a true sociopath and had emerged victorious, but not unscathed. Months after the trial, on a crisp, clear autumn day, Miles found himself drawn back to the antique shop in the village. The new owner of Blackwood Manor had auctioned off its contents, and the shopkeeper had managed to acquire a few of the smaller pieces. As Miles browsed through the dusty relics, the shopkeeper called to him. "Detective, I thought you might be interested in this." He held out a small, ornate key. It was the custom-made winding key for the Kronos, the one Alistair had purchased just days before his death. It was found in a hidden compartment in his desk. Seems he never even got the chance to use it. Miles took the key, the cold metal heavy in his hand. It was the last loose thread in a case that had been a tapestry of them. Why had Alistair needed a new key when Clara had one? He would likely never know for sure. Perhaps it was a sign of his controlling nature, his desire to be the sole master of his prized possession. Or perhaps it was something more, a premonition, a desperate attempt to secure his world in the face of an unseen threat. The case was officially over, but the story of the clock that stopped at midnight would become a permanent part of the local lore, a dark fairy tale whispered for generations. It was a story about a house of secrets, a cursed clock, and a murder that was a masterpiece of deception. As Miles left the shop, the key in his pocket, he looked up at the sky. Time, he reflected, was a relentless force. It moved forward, healed wounds, and buried the past. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that some moments, some secrets, could be so powerful that they could stop time itself. They could freeze a single, perfect, terrible moment and make it last forever. He walked away from the village, away from the shadow of Blackwood Manor, but he knew he would never truly leave it behind. The image of the grandfather clock, its hands pointing to the heavens, its heart silent, would be forever etched in his memory. It was a silent sentinel, a timeless monument to a chilling mystery, and a stark reminder that the most dangerous secrets are not the ones that are buried, but the ones that are hidden in plain sight, ticking away, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The clock was no longer a clue. It was a warning, and for Miles, its silence was the loudest sound he had ever heard.